"I know," she said, not unkindly. Just the fact of it laid on the table between us where we put facts now. "I felt you leave. Halfway through. You were nodding." A small wry tilt of her mouth. "You're a very good nodder." My Playful Wife. Episode 31. The Fifth Notebook. Written by Mia. I bought the fifth notebook on an ordinary Wednesday, and I almost didn't write in it, and that almost is the whole of what this volume is about. The first four had been easy to begin. In the way that grief and astonishment are easy to begin, they wrote themselves because something enormous was happening to me, and the writing was the only railing I had to hold. The first notebook began because my life had broken open on a balcony and I needed somewhere to put the pieces. The second began because the pieces were rearranging into something I did not recognize and had to describe in order to believe. The third and fourth began because the new thing was so large and so good that I was frightened of taking it for granted, and the notebooks were my method against that fear, the daily discipline of attention, the refusal to sleep through my own life a second time. But the fifth notebook had no catastrophe to begin it. That was the difficulty. I stood in the stationery shop on Wednesday with the new notebook in my hand. The same kind, the dark cloth cover, the cream pages. I am loyal to the small things, and I realized I did not know what it was for. The crisis was over. The marriage was not breaking. It was the soundest structure in my life. The brother who had once called with a blade in his voice now called with a job offer for a cousin and a complaint about Bengaluru traffic. The wound that had organized four notebooks had healed into the foundation everything else stood on. And a man does not, conventionally, keep a journal of his own contentment. Contentment is supposed to be the place where the story stops. And they lived happily, the closing of the book, the thing that needs no further pages because nothing further happens. I paid for the notebook anyway. I am loyal to the small things. But I carried it home unsure and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it across 2 days the way you look at a tool whose purpose you have forgotten and did not open it. What made me open it, in the end, was fear, the same engine that had begun all the others. Only this time the fear wore a costume I almost didn't recognize because it had dressed itself as peace. It happened on the Friday, an ordinary Friday evening. Saloni came home from the workroom later than usual. The third collection is pressing towards December show, the deadline reel again, the beautiful old pressure back at her shoulders, and she came in tired and full of it. The work, the color she had finally found for the seventh piece, the way the drape had failed, and then suddenly not failed. And she stood in the kitchen telling me about it with her hands moving the way they move when the making is going well, and I wasn't listening. I want to be precise about this, because it frightened me more than anything had frightened me in 2 years. I was not bored. I was not unkind. I was nodding in the right places. I was making the right sounds. From the outside, I was a husband listening to his wife. But somewhere behind my eyes I had gone away. I was half in tomorrow's emails, half in nothing at all, and the woman in front of me, the entire unmapped country, the fire I had spent 2 years learning to see, had become, for the length of that conversation, background. Furniture. The known quantity. The wife telling the work story, while the husband nods. I had heard the shape of it and stopped listening to the substance because I knew the shape because I had heard 100 work stories because she was familiar, and the familiar is the thing the mind files away so it can attend to something else. And then she said, "So, I think I'll cut it on the bias after all," and looked at me for the answer, and I had to surface from wherever I'd been, and I didn't have the answer because I hadn't heard the question, and she saw it.
Of course she saw it.
She sees everything. That is the whole architecture of us now. She didn't say anything sharp. She just paused, a small pause, and something crossed her face. Not hurt exactly, but a flicker of an old recognition, and she finished her tea and said she was tired, and the evening folded up early. And I sat at the table after she'd gone to bed with my heart going hard, because I had recognized the flicker. I had seen it before. I had been the cause of it before, not in the bad year, but before that, in the years before the balcony, the comfortable years, the sleeping years. The flicker was the look of a woman being half-heard by a man who has decided, without knowing he has decided it, that he already knows her. It was the look from before. It was the first frost of the old sleep coming back, in the middle of the best life I had ever had. I opened the 5th notebook that night. I wrote, at the top of the cream first page, in a hand that was not quite steady, "The danger has changed its name." And then below it, the thing I had just understood at the kitchen table, the thing that would turn out to be the whole spine of this volume, that the first 4 notebooks had been written against a catastrophe, and the 5th would have to be written against something far more dangerous, because catastrophe at least keeps you awake. Grief is many things, but it is never drowsy. The bad year had been the worst of my life, and it had also been, in one narrow sense, easy. It had made attention compulsory. You do not sleepwalk through a fire. You cannot take for granted a thing that is actively breaking. The crisis had done my waking for me, had held my eyes open by force, had made every glance at my wife a matter of survival. But the crisis was over, and nothing was holding my eyes open now except my own will. The fire that had kept me awake had become a hearth, warm and safe and steady, and the terrible secret of a hearth is that you can fall asleep in front of one. That was the danger that had changed its name. In the bad year, the danger was that I would lose her. In the good years, these years, the ones I was only now entering, the ones the 5th notebook would have to be the instrument against, the danger was subtler and worse. That I would keep her and have her and stop seeing her. That I would let the most extraordinary person I had ever known curdle slowly back into furniture, not through any drama, not through betrayal or rupture, but through the sheer relentless gravity of the familiar, the way a sound you hear every day stops being a sound at all. I had a neighbor once, in the years before all this, who lived hard against the railway line, and he swore he no longer heard the trains, that his ears had edited them out, that the great nightly thunder of the express had become, to him, a kind of silence. I had thought it a charming little story about the adaptability of the mind. I understood now that it was a horror story, and that it was about marriage. The mind edits out the constant. It is built to, it must, or we would be deafened by our own lives. And the most constant, most reliable, most every single morning thing in my world was the woman across the table, which meant she was precisely the thing my mind would try hardest to stop hearing, the way it had taught itself to stop hearing the trains. I had thought 2 years ago that waking up was the hard part. I had been wrong. Waking up is easy. A catastrophe will do it for you, free of charge. Staying awake, that is the work. Staying awake when nothing is forcing you to, when the woman across the table is safe and loved and yours and has been telling you her work stories for years and will, God willing, tell you 10,000 more. Staying awake to that, to the daily miracle that has stopped announcing itself as a miracle precisely because it arrives every single day. That is the discipline of a lifetime, and no crisis comes to help you with it, and most marriages, I understood, sitting there with the 5th notebook open, do not fail in fire at all. They fail in this, in the slow gray sleep that feels like peace, in the nodding husband who has stopped hearing the question. I was not going to do that. I had paid too much for the seeing to let it dim into a habit. That was what the 5th notebook was for. I had found its purpose. It was not a journal of my contentment. It was a watch I would have to keep against my own contentment, against the specific drowsiness that good fortune breeds, the the sleep that wears the mask of peace. In the morning, I did a thing I had not done in a long while because I had not needed to. I apologized for something invisible. She was at the counter, hair undone, the third collection worry already back in the set of her shoulders, and I made the chai and brought it to her right hand the way I do, and I said, "Last night, you were telling me about the bias cut, and I wasn't there. I heard the words. I wasn't listening.
I'm sorry."
She turned and looked at me, and the morning held still for a second the way it does when one of us says the true thing instead of the easy one. "I know," she said, not unkindly, just the fact of it, laid on the table between us where we put facts now. "I felt you leave. Halfway through. You were nodding." A small wry tilt of her mouth. "You're a very good nodder. You'd fool anyone who hadn't married you." "I don't want to be a good nodder." "I know that too." She wrapped her hands around the cup, both of them, the old gesture. And then she said the thing that told me, again, why I had stayed, why I would always stay, why the second marriage to this woman was the only sane decision of my life. "It's going to happen, you know." You leaving in the middle of a sentence. "Me too. I do it to you. I've done it this week. I stopped hearing you tell me about your brother's cousin because I was 3 stitches deep in the 7th piece. It's not the crime. We're not going to be awake every minute for the rest of our lives. Nobody is. That's not a marriage. That's a vigil, and a vigil is exhausting and false." She looked at me over the steam. "The thing isn't never leaving. The thing is coming back. You came back. You noticed you'd gone and you came back and you said so. That's not the failure. That's the whole of it. That's the work." I have written somewhere in the earlier notebooks that she is almost always right, and that her rightness is of a particular kind. Not cleverness, though she is clever, but a sort of structural honesty, a refusal to let either of us hide inside a flattering version of the trouble. She had just done it again. I had come to the kitchen braced to confess a sin, and she had quietly reclassified it. Not a sin, but the ordinary tax of 2 minds sharing a life, payable not in never faltering but in the noticing and the coming back. There is a particular relief in being told that the standard is not perfection. I had spent the whole night building a cathedral of vigilance in my head, a marriage in which I would never once drift, never once nod, never once let my attention slip its leash, and the building of it had exhausted me before breakfast, because it was impossible, and some part of me had known it was impossible, and had therefore quietly begun to despair. She had knocked the cathedral down with a single sentence over a cup of tea, and put something livable in its place. Not a vigil, but a practice. Not perfection, but repair. The danger was real. I was not wrong about the danger, but the defense against it was not the impossible vigilance I had been imagining at midnight. The defense was smaller and kinder, and infinitely more sustainable. Notice that you've gone. Come back.
Say so.
The marriage did not require me to never sleep. It required me to keep waking up. So that is how Volume 2 begins. Not with a catastrophe, with a chai and an apology for a sin that turned out to be only a tax, and a wife reclassifying my midnight terror into something a person can actually live inside. The 5th notebook will be different from the others, I can already tell. The first 4 were written in weather, storm, flood, the long thaw, the first dry season. This one will be written in climate, which is harder to see and harder to write, because climate does not announce itself in a single dramatic morning. It is the slow accumulated average of 10,000 ordinary ones. The drama of the bad year is over and will not, I hope, return. What replaces it is not the absence of story, but a quieter and more demanding kind. The story of whether two people who have learned to see each other can keep seeing each other across the long, flat decades, with no fire to force it, with familiarity working against them every single day, like a soft, steady tide that wants to wear the looking smooth.
I think we can.
I think the noticing and coming back is a real method and not a comfort I am telling myself. But I am not certain, and the uncertainty is I have decided a good sign, because the day I become certain we will keep seeing each other is the day I will stop watching for the sleep, and the stopping to watch is exactly how the sleep gets in. So I will stay a little afraid. I will keep the fifth notebook the way a sailor keeps an eye on a calm sea, which is more carefully, not less, because the calm is when you drown. My grandfather, who had spent his working life on ships, told me once that the sea takes more men in fair weather than in storms, because in a storm, every man is lashed to his post and awake, and in fair weather they go below and sleep, trusting the flat water. I did not understand him when I was a boy. Fair weather sounded like the safe part. I understand him now. The flat water is not the safe part. The flat water is the test that does not look like a test, and the men it takes are the ones who mistook the absence of a storm for the absence of a sea. December is coming, and the third collection with it, Saloni's biggest yet, the one the December room will be full of strangers to witness, and I will be at the edge of that room where I do my best living, watching the people watch her work walk into the light. There is Bengaluru ahead, the promised trip, the dinner with the four of us at my brother's table in his new life. There are Diwalis and the Dias along the railing, and Saloni's hands teaching Mira the order of the lighting the way her own mother taught her. There are, I am counting on it, 10,000 ordinary Tuesdays, the chai and the small notebook and the look across the table. And there is this, which is the only resolution I have to offer at the opening of a new volume, the only vow worth making at the start of the long awake years, that when she tells me about the bias cut, I will listen to the substance and not just the shape. That when the country of her becomes familiar, I will remember that familiar is not the same as known, that I have not finished mapping her and will not finish until one of us dies, that the most dangerous sentence in any marriage is I already know what she's going to say. I will keep waking up. I will notice when I've gone. I will come back. And I will write it all down in the fifth notebook, in climate rather than weather, one ordinary witness morning at a time, because the watching is the loving, and the loving is the staying, and the staying, it turns out, was never a thing you did once on a balcony 2 years ago. It is a thing you do this morning, and then again tomorrow, for as long as the mornings last. She finished her chai. She put the cup in the sink. She came past me on her way to the door and the workroom and the seventh piece, and she stopped and put her hand on the back of my neck for a moment. Warm from the cup, the small proprietary sentence she says with her hands, and she said, "Tell me about your brother's cousin tonight."
The whole thing.
I'll actually listen this time. I'll actually tell it, I said. We'll see, she said, and the wry mouth, and the door, and gone. I opened the fifth notebook and wrote down the morning while the chai was still warm in me. Day 1 of the awake years. The danger has changed its name, and so has the work. Not never leaving. Coming back. She taught me that before breakfast, the way she teaches me everything sideways, while pretending to talk about a cup. And then I closed it, and went to start my own day, lighter than I had been at midnight, a man who had found, at last, what the fifth notebook was for. To be continued in episode 32, The Bias Cut.
Simbolo di copyright mia.
All rights reserved. That was episode 31 of my Playful Wife. If this story is staying with you, the next episode is already waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The complete book is on Amazon, and early episodes plus bonus chapters are on my Patreon. Links are in the description.
Mia.
Thank you for listening.